June 5, 1944, just before dawn at Southwick House near Portsmouth. A quiet room held men studying a weather map, while outside, the channel heaved under hard winds and steep waves. The constraints sat in a stack no bravado could flatten. The tide had to be low at first light to expose beach obstacles. The moon had to be bright enough for paratroopers to find their drop zones. The wind had to ease, so landing craft wouldn't swamp. Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a plain question. Do we launch the invasion now, or do we wait and send the Armada home? He had already said, wait, once. Hours earlier, the seas were running rough, and the cloud deck sat low, which meant aircraft navigation would be unreliable, and small craft would be punished all the way to the beaches. The storm forced a delay from June 5th to a possible June 6th or 7, a narrow window when tide and moon might still line up. A spring tide is the extra high and extra low tide that comes with full or new moons. For this plan, they wanted the low end of that swing right at dawn. That gave assault engineers room to cut through mined obstacles before the water rose, a working window of roughly 3 hours. As night turned to morning on June 5th, the forecast officer reported one fragile opening. A brief break, perhaps 24 to 36 hours, might sweep in from the Atlantic and soften the winds below the point where landing craft flip and planes disappear into cloud. No one promised calm, only tolerable. Eisenhower listened as each commander spoke to his own hazard. The Navy feared the swell, because breaking seas would scatter formations and drown men close to shore. The Air Forces needed a ceiling high enough to see waypoints and drop pathfinders. Even 1,000 feet of clear air could be the difference between a scattered regiment and a usable airborne attack. The Army needed the tide and daylight, which were fixed by the moon and the clock, no matter what the wind did. Logistics pressed from every side. More than 5,000 ships and landing craft were already staged. Many were at sea and would need a day to turn back. Convoys burned fuel, just holding position. Secrecy had a shelf life, because every extra day meant more chance for German patrols, rumors in ports and aerial reconnaissance to spot the mass. Morale was a real constraint. Men out on grey water get sick and anxious. Men sent back after a launch become doubtful that the planners can ever choose a day. Within this 48-72-hour band, options narrowed. They could push through on June 5th despite the storm, but at that wind speed, the smallest craft risked foundering, and the airborne drops would be chaos. They could wait 2 weeks for the next moon and tide alignment, but that meant disbanding the convoys, hiding thousands of ships again, and trusting that weather and secrecy would both be kinder in late June. Both alternatives had serious costs that were visible that morning. Go now had costs too, but it offered one advantage that mattered: surprise. Because the weather was foul, German commanders judged a cross-channel assault unlikely, which meant reserves were not on immediate alert and air patrols were thinner. Stormy seas also shielded the Armada, since distant observers would struggle to pick out ships in the chop and haze. In the late evening of June 5th, Eisenhower called his staff back to the same quiet room. Outside, the wind still spoke against boldness, but the forecast held to a short lull. Winds might drop into the teens in knots, below the rough threshold for capsizing the smallest craft, and the ceiling might lift just enough for navigators to find the Normandy coast. He asked his commanders one more round of questions, seeking not certainty, which was impossible, but failure points. He heard that the assault could proceed at high risk, but not reckless risk. The hinge came down to one sentence he had to answer for himself. Do I risk a hard landing tomorrow for the chance to catch the enemy unready, or do I risk the whole plan by waiting for perfect conditions that may never arrive? He chose to go. To keep terms clear, H hour is the time the first wave hits the beach. D-Day is simply the day of the operation. Setting D-Day for June 6th set every other clock. Airborne drops just after midnight, naval gunfire on target before dawn, and first waves reaching sand near 06:30. The order rippled at once. Convoy columns, already strung across hundreds of miles, changed headings and committed to the run through the night. Airborne troops checked their gear again and boarded planes into headwinds that promised a rough ride. Because the weather still punished precision, some drops would land far from their zones and some craft would swamp, but delay now would have bled away surprise. By midnight, June 6th had begun. The seas remained steep, yet acceptable. A cloud ceiling lifted just enough for pathfinders to mark a few beacons, while others failed and left paratroopers scattered across hedgerows, a tactical mess that, paradoxically, confused German response. At dawn, the tide turned on schedule. Engineers saw obstacles they could cut and mark. The window, about 3 usable hours before the rising water swallowed the stakes and mines, was real, not theoretical. On the beaches, the weather made landings ragged. Some sectors saw the surf shove landing craft off course. Others found their timing intact. Air bombardment fell short in places because clouds forced higher releases. But here the earlier choice showed its logic. The storm had pushed German assumptions off balance. Many believed no one would attempt a crossing in such seas, which meant some units were slow to react and senior commanders were not on site. Waiting 2 weeks would have meant breaking up the armada, rehearsing secrecy all over again, and trusting to kinder skies. We know now, though they did not, that a severe gale smashed the channel in mid-June. Had the invasion sailed then, temporary harbours would have been torn apart before a firm foothold existed. In the window of June 6th, weather hurt both sides, but it hurt surprise less than delay would have. Therefore, go now, beat wait. It kept convoys from lingering where U-boats could nose them out. It denied the enemy 2 weeks to strengthen beaches and shift reserves. And it acted while the deception campaign still held German attention on the Pas-de-Calais. It also honored the fixed arithmetic of tide and moon that would not wait for perfect skies. By evening on June 6th, the immediate effects were visible. Allied forces held linked beachheads on Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, shallow in places, deeper in others, but continuous and supplied. The surf still broke, the wind still nagged, and casualties were heavy on some sands, yet the line held and logistics began to pour across. A foothold existed on the continent, fragile, costly, and real. From that foothold came the long-tail result. Within weeks, as weather patterns shifted and ports were opened, the beachhead enabled a breakout from the bocage, the hedge-walled fields that slowed armor, and operations like Cobra burst through to Avranches and beyond. From there, the road to Paris and the German frontier opened in stages that would have been impossible without that first storm-tolerant landing. Some details remain debated. The exact wind thresholds each service would accept, which cloud breaks mattered most, even how much surprise the weather truly brought. But the core remains clear. A commander weighed tide, moon, and wind against secrecy, morale, and logistics, then chose a flawed day that the enemy deemed impossible. In 48 hours, the decision moved from a quiet room to a beachhead that changed the strategic map of Europe. One distilled takeaway endures. Decisive leadership is not about finding perfect conditions, but about acting in the least bad window when timing, physics, and human factors briefly align. If this turning point drew you in, like and subscribe for more from Vanguard Lore.